Couple minutes to allow people to arrive. Mark's going to give us some musical accompaniment while we wait, and then we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you, Mark. We're going to go ahead and get started. This session today will be recorded, and anybody who was able to register but wasn't able to attend will be able to watch. Today we're going to talk about what we can learn to better prepare for the next one. I just give a little bit of background about Base Cybersecurity. We were started in honor of Becky Base, who was a pioneer and a leader in cybersecurity. And our mission is really to continue her work, her legacy, and to make the internet and computers safer for everybody. I want to thank our sponsors and speakers, particularly Barracuda, for hosting our webinar series so far, and all of these speakers that are present today. Their companies have donated their time, and they're all volunteers to put this organization together. We're hoping that if you see ideas you like, you'll join us and help participate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Thank you. Have you stopped sharing your screen?
Yes. There you go.
Okay, good. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have developed about 150 people who were watching the videos, but it's really great to have a live audience, and we thank you for taking the time to join us. We're going to be talking about not just how we can protect the medical infrastructure today, but how we can better prepare for the next wave or the next pandemic. Our panel for today, Fleming Shi. Fleming is responsible for raising the alarm that generated this whole thing. So it's all his fault that we're here. And Bo Woods, Bo is the one who, when we first started, we thought we would just do one webinar, and he's the one who said, no, you should do a series. So he's the second one who's responsible for us being here today. And he's been helping us with our action plan, trying to convert just information into some real progress in terms of action with the US federal government. And Diana Newman is here. Diana has been participating as the executive director of Base Cybersecurity Institute. She's taking that hat off today and putting on her hat as VP of On Guard Systems and joining us as a panelist. And so this will be her first time to be, instead of herding cats, to be one of the cats. So the problem we have as a society is, first, we have this exponential increase in the number of attacks taking advantage of the pandemic. They're attacking individuals, they're attacking hospitals, and Bo was, again, instrumental in pointing out, because when we think about this, we think about, oh, New York City and the problems in Manhattan. But he was the first to make us really focus on the fact that a university hospital in Manhattan has resources that a regional or local hospital in Albany, Georgia, which is one of the particularly hard-hit rural areas, or in the Dakotas or in Iowa, they just don't have the resources, but they're getting the same kinds of attacks. And then the medical supply chains, we're seeing attacks now on unemployment insurance that's become such an issue with so many people out of work because of the shelter at home orders. And we're seeing attacks on Social Security for the same reason. And there's a large volume of recovery funding. I have not seen reports on attacks there, but I have to believe that there's going to be attacks there. And it's not like this is the first time it's happened. Depending on how you define it, this is the third, fourth, or fifth major epidemic on a global basis that we've faced, and we have the same problems over and over. What happens is, during the crisis, we spin everything up, and then as soon as the crisis is over, we just stop, and everything dries up and turns to dust and blows away in the wind. And then the next time we start over from scratch, like we've never done this before. And what we're trying to do this time is to learn from what's happening and then to better prepare for the next one. And to do that, we need to do three things. First, we need to develop a complete data set. Second, we have to perform analysis on the data set, and that analysis should yield recommendations. So we've had several webinars, and they've done a really great job of giving clear indication that there's a problem. And there's been good data, but all that data is considered, you could call it a sample. It's not a complete data set. And it's hard to gather a complete data set because, first, data is scattered. We have local and national and maybe even international police agencies have data. We have military cyber forces that have data. We have intelligence agencies that have data. We have many commercial players, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, who are collecting data. And then, again, we don't know who's going to be monitoring the distribution of recovery funds. Politically, that's up in the air in the United States, and other parts of the world, it's being handled in different ways, and we don't know how that's going to be tracked. And fundamentally, when you start talking about people who are responsible for saving lives on a minute-by-minute basis, they're too busy fighting alligators to stop and document the attacks and even sometimes to report them. So not all of the data is actually reported or captured, which leads to some questions about how we can get better data. So our response is collect a complete data set, perform analysis, and make recommendations. And we have to make separate recommendations to governments, and of course, different types of governments and different cultures and different levels of government. may have different recommendations. We have to have recommendations for industry. I think academia is also important, and they're probably going to have different recommendations there. And the intersection of academia and hospitals is an important one, and also academia and research. And then we may have recommendations for not-for-profit organizations. So with this, I'm going to start the discussion with the panel. And the first question for the panel, we haven't done the study. So, you know, once we actually do a study, a really rigorous study, and to do that, of course, we're going to need funding and some a professional team to do it. But without that, just based on what we have now, what ways might be available to gather existing information? And are there innovative ways that we might use to gather more information? And did I forget any questions about gathering data? So with that, let me start with Fleming. Fleming, would you like to start to answer these questions?
Sure. I actually do have a little bit of something to share with you guys. So at Barracuda, obviously, we have a large install base. So when we see this type of attacks, when we need to actually, you know, take what we call evidence, when we see the threats, we pick them up and analyze them behind the scene through various different engines. So let me share with you what I got here. This is something that I worked with my team for a while. This is something what we call the Barracuda Cybersecurity Index. The concept here is kind of like a measurement of attacks that's actually succeeding or failing, and based on you know, their efficacy and where they're coming from. And this index, if you look at it, there's a histogram that shows. You guys can see my screen, right? I know the fonts are a little small, but I can zoom in a certain section here and there. But you can see that we're tracking this for a long time now. Really, just trying to figure out what kind of attacks are happening. And so I will say that the right way to think about what might be good to actually as innovation to gather data, collect data. You know, as a vendor in the industry, I think one of the things is to measure the efficacy of the attacks. And you can see we also categorized by the type of weapons people are using, you know, let it be Office documents or PDFs and portable executables, how they're actually propagating, and what we see when we block them, right? And obviously, there's a lot more detail on this platform. We have various different attack by services, which is really different kind of attack surfaces. So generally, I think to answer your question, I believe one of the important things to consider as a vendor, you know, I invite all the vendors in cybersecurity to actually step up and actually gather data based on different threat vectors, understanding the separation, really kind of slice the data in a way that we can understand the capabilities of the bad guys. And one of the reasons we created this, it's not like a vulnerability scanner, like, you know, like you check out the risk score and stuff like that. No, we obviously have something like that, but it's actually, to me, it's more important to understand at a global level what threats are actually active, right? And how effective they are. And the score that we put in the index is based on an algorithm that we developed that really identifies you know, the efficacy based on a certain weapon, the likelihood of a human clicking on a threat, things like that. So I think this is one way to actually gather the information, make sure the information is available, and the question about the innovation related to data, I think we got to get the data first and make sure we don't miss anything. That's why I wanted to make sure Barracuda product lines are actually able to contribute to this platform internally, right? And the reason you can see this is also important. This is artifacts by scanners. So we have various different kind of scanners here. So right now I have the logarithmic view. If you look at linear view, you can see some of the dynamic sandbox capabilities we utilize here. It's much smaller. What I mean there is there's still large volumetric kind of attacks, right? Then if you look at the smaller set in logarithmic way, you can actually see them, and you can see we detect these zero day, 0 hour threats on all the time, right? So my point there is it's important to actually categorize them, understand the taxonomy of the attacks, understand the weapons, and as a as the industry develop ways to actually work together, we can share that data, right? And it's also build APIs so the data can be syndicated across and help people.
So Fleming, just to be clear,
Hmm.
the data that you're showing has been gathered by instruments in your product installed around the world.
This is data that originates from microservices that we deploy around the world to service our global install base.
Correct. So this is a snapshot of what your
That's right.
service products see.
Yes.
So another vendor who has products would see a different sample.
That's true.
They might overlap, but they might not. They might be completely separate.
Absolutely, absolutely. And remember, this is only stats. That's the first thing. And remember, I shared in the sessions earlier, in the last few sessions, in the webinar, some samples. Those are the actual evidence when we start to see, hey, we need to figure out why this weapon is so effective, or why is it highly effective. Then what we do is we dive in and collect the evidence. Obviously, it's a malicious. We only collect malicious weapons. Once we have it, we dissect it. Then from there, we continue to improve our efficacy, our efficiency in handling those new threats. The other area I want to point folks to look at real quick on this chart is what we call link protection. So link protection, again, is another, I will say, data really that matters to human because link protection is a service that protects people at point of click. So let's say Mark is on the beach or playing guitar, somewhere, kind of distracted, enjoying his music, but he pulls out his phone. There's a link that was sent from Fleming or someone from base and could be impersonating. So in that scenario, when he clicks on it, that link will be analyzed for malicious content. And at that point, we protect him. Why is that important? Because actually, I will say well-known web frameworks like WordPress and various different kind of frameworks, they all have vulnerabilities. And a lot of times the bad guys will wait and actually inject content in there. So a legitimate website can be weaponized in the future. So a link that might be safe today could be weaponized later on. So that's why it's important to have that protection at point of click. So this shows, obviously you can see we're actively preventing people getting hurt at the point of click at a pretty high rate. And of course there's millions of good stuff, but hundreds of thousands of bad stuff we're preventing people from getting to, which is really good because I just see this number increase, especially throughout the year. In the old days, seasonal attacks, I would say, let it be Black Friday or Cyber Monday, those kind of, online shopping days, you get a lot of brand impersonation kind of phishing attacks. We can stop them all, right? So, but I just,
for clarification, this is all attacks. This is not attacks focused on medical infrastructure or medical supply chains.
Right. This is all attacks. Right now, what I'm showing you is not specific to COVID-19. Right. Mhm.
So, okay, but
Mhm.
this is good to understand what one vendor catches
That's
and
right.
as
And
a part of its business.
yeah, I'm pretty sure other vendors are also doing great in the area. We represent the SMB a little bit stronger. We have a lot of enterprise customers. Our solutions are,
So that's the small and medium-sized business.
that's right. And the
It's
reason
important,
that
what's important here to emphasize again is that the regional and rural offices
hmm,
I mean, regional and rural hospitals
yeah,
are
yep,
typically small and medium-sized businesses.
hmm,
And
that's right.
these are the people who have the least capability and and when they're overwhelmed, are the most overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could come back. I know you have more material to show. I wonder if we could um, stop this portion right now.
Yep.
And
Okay.
and I wonder if Bo might want to make some comments on this question.
Yeah, sure. One of my first jobs out of college was I worked at a small regional healthcare provider near Atlanta, Georgia. Uh, we were, mostly funded by Medicare, Medicaid. We're a nonprofit, so a lot of people don't think about hospitals as nonprofits. Um, and we were highly resource constrained. So as Mark said at the beginning, a lot of these organizations, you may think of hospitals like Johns Hopkins or the Mayo Clinic, big for-profit organizations. They have really large, very well-resourced security teams. But something like 80 to 90% of healthcare is delivered by small organizations. These are offices that may have 2 doctors or a hospital with 10 to 12 beds. And they're really not well equipped and staffed for being able to defend against security threats. One of the reasons is obviously economic, because if you have the choice between hiring a CISO and a doctor, which one do you go for? Which one's going to help you better serve your mission of taking care of patients? Well, the doctor in almost all cases, until you get to a certain scale and size. And so when we think about their ability to collect, ingest data, analyze data from, not just companies like Fleming's, but from the dozens or hundreds of other companies out there doing other good things as well, that have different data sets, or taking consolidated feeds from the information sharing and analysis centers, information sharing and analysis organizations that are out there, they really get overwhelmed. And so when we think about, or when I think about, how do we start looking at these types of attacks? How do we start gathering the data? A lot of those organizations won't be instrumented at all. So we have to look at other sources rather than just the cybersecurity tooling that they might have, because they might not have tooling, rather than just the professionals that are there because they might not be there. I think it's an open question about how we can get some of that data, how we can get some of that information. Maybe there's some that can sit at the ISP level, or some way for a program to have the ISP get clearance from the hospital to start watching data on their behalf, or providing some of these services. Maybe there's some way to provide a zero configuration type service that won't potentially interfere with hospital workflows, because that's one of the big concerns, that could be more or less transparent, and just look at this information, look at these types of attacks, start pulling them in. So really trying to get some more innovative, creative things that we could do on a national level, at national scale, that might be for a public health purpose first and foremost. Public cyber health, not to coin a phrase, but for that purpose, as opposed to the individual companies, hospitals, or healthcare providers individually collecting this data and feeding it up. Maybe there could be a national scale effort, a grand challenge, if you will, to start looking at how we collect this data in a privacy preserving manner, in a way that protects protected health information, but in a way that can help us to track it, analyze it, and get ahead of potential issues, or at least help protect things, kind of like what the CDC does for diseases, but on a much different type of an infrastructure, organization, and timescale.
That's a great idea. You point out the ISP as a potential source. The telco is also a potential source.
Yeah, I use those two terms interchangeably: telecoms versus internet service providers. It just depends on what scale and what types of services they're providing sometimes.
No, but I think having them thinking about both is really valuable. I think that's a good, valuable contribution. Thank you both. Diana, would you like to comment on this question?
Sure. I think there are sort of, and we've sort of talked about, there are two ways that people look at this type of data collection. One is you dive into the details and you say, this is the problem we're facing, and we try to fix that problem. And when I first started out in cybersecurity, I was a penetration tester, and that was primarily what you're looking at. Is you go out, you think this is going to be this great and wonderful job, you're going to find these problems and get to fix them. And it turns out it is the absolute worst job in cybersecurity, because when you don't have the time needed to look at the whole picture, you don't have the time needed to explore anything really in depth. And so you spend a week and you find brand new vulnerabilities, and you go and you tell them, these are your brand new vulnerabilities that it took me, a whole week to discover. And they say, okay, fixed, what's next, right? So the improvement is substantial, or is significant, but it isn't substantial in the sense that it looks at the big picture, what Mark and what Bo and Fleming have been talking about, in terms of it doesn't get you the landscape of what is going on. Recently, I've been indoctrinated into the world of electronic warfare. And so I have some slides that talk about how that sort of relates to the issue that we're talking about now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that okay, Mark?
Yes.
Okay, so in the world of signals intelligence, you have this array of potential data coming at you. You have this array of signals that are coming at you. And most antennas can only see a very small sliver of what's going on in front of them. In this case, we're looking at just a very particular band, which is open to basically anybody who wants to use these frequencies can put up data. And because your antenna only gets a very narrow window of what's going on, you can't see, well, maybe like 10 frequencies over, there's this huge attack that's going on, and you really want to explore it. And so I think that's one of the issues that we face in cybersecurity, is that the scope of attacks, the scope of data is so large that it's selecting where you want to look in that picture and trying to collect all that data is immense. One of the things that you mentioned in your slides was, how do we collect complete data? And this becomes a big problem, is how much storage do you need in order to record all of these signal points? There's a signal in the middle of this screen that has these dots, right? So it's transmitting only a little bit over time. Well, if I miss the time window that particular signal was going past, I've missed out on the opportunity to investigate it or find out more about it. And so I think we face a lot of those same problems in cybersecurity. And one of the other things I think that's interesting to point out is that there's a noise level. In order to tell what's an attack and what isn't an attack, you have to have a concept of what a good baseline looks like. In signals intelligence, this is a little bit easier because you can kind of see there's some background noise. But in cybersecurity, this gets very, very hard. Is how do you tell a system that hasn't been compromised from a system that has been compromised? And some of the the challenges that we have in underreported attacks is that people don't know. You have attackers that have been on their networks or their organization for months and months, and they may not know that they have been infected or when they were infected and so forth. And so I think that that's also one of the issues is as we identify the types of information that we want to disseminate, how do we get that out to people, and then what can they do about it, and can we get a baseline established as well as the anomalous parts? There are a couple of areas that we do have some data. We have attack data in terms of what particular signatures look like. There's both virus data and so forth, and those come out as like CVE numbers or CERT. We have survey data, which is exactly the kind of thing that Fleming was talking about. Is one of the wonderful things about vendors and industry is that they get to look at a lot of different customers. And so they can pull together information from a lot of different sources. One of the big benefits of this is this automatically sort of anonymizes the data. And I think it's one of the challenges that as we look at how do we collect data and how do we pull it in, is how do we make sure that that data doesn't itself become a compromise to the organizations that are providing it. And so by pooling data between across an industry through either a vendor or an academic or nonprofit sort of setting where you take data from a lot of different sources and then do the summary, it helps provide some of that privacy. But you also lose some of the details, right? You inherently lose, did they slice the data by industry or did they slice it by attack type? How do you go back and unslice if you need to, if your questions change? In terms of the noise floor that I was talking about, there's some ability to collect and some data that out there already exists. There's a site called Census that does a survey of all the services running on the internet, and they do that almost every day. So if you have like a vulnerability in a particular type of database, you can say, well, I've seen this many attacks, but we could start using that sort of survey data or the background data to say, I've seen 5 attacks, but there are 50,000 of that particular database that are open and available on the internet for anybody to probe or attack. So in terms of Fleming's efficacy is you can start baselining the existence and then how the attacks fit into the background of what's out there on the internet. And then I think one of the areas that I would love to see more of is incident analysis. We saw a really good case when Target had an attack. It became such a big deal that they ended up testifying in front of Congress. And so there was a huge amount of data released around their incident analysis. And so you can see they have the whole timeline of a vendor had a spoofed password, or had a bad password, which was then guessed by an attacker, which then allowed them to get to a vendor website, which then allowed them to move inside. And they have the whole timeline mapped out of how that incident moved through the network. Without that kind of a threat model analysis or what the root causes of the traffic are, it's difficult to determine where our resources are weak. Where is it a password thing? Is it the vendor got confused? Is it a human resources thing? Is it a layering thing? Right, we need to identify what particular areas that need improvement. Mark, I will turn it back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. Bo, I know you have to leave early because of a prior conflict. And I know you have some comments you'd like to make before you leave. I turn you over to you.
Thanks. When we turn to what to do with this data and what to do with this analysis, once we've collected it, once we've done the project, and once we've looked at it, I think there's a number of potential outcomes. And I think it's important to think about these holistically and systemically, right, across the entire healthcare ecosystem. Not just, as I mentioned, the large hospitals, but also the small healthcare providers as well. There are some that with enough available tools and with enough information, they can help themselves. they can defend their organizations. And there's some where, if it's a 10-person company, they really probably don't have the capabilities or the free cash flow to be able to have a full-time security person looking at this stuff, or even bringing them in periodically. In those cases, for those smaller organizations, we have to think differently about how we do this. And as well, we have to look across not just the healthcare providers, but also medical device makers. So for every Philips or BD or Medtronic that's out there, you probably have 10 to 20, maybe even more small companies you've never heard of. I was working with a company a couple of weeks ago, and it's 6 employees. They're creating something that's probably going to save a ton of lives, but they don't have the staff to be able to defend themselves. So we have to think about systemic defense. The Department of Health and Human Services in the US had a task force in 2016 on cybersecurity, and they published their report in, I think it was June 2017. And they listed a bunch of recommendations. But before that, on page 1, they had a great graphic, and I'd encourage you to go out and take a look at this if you haven't seen it already. It said healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition, and it listed off 5 reasons for this. The first is something I've talked about a couple of times, which is the lack of qualified professionals to do cybersecurity within healthcare for many, many good reasons. The second is kind of an overdependence on undependable technology. So a lot of these technologies are maybe decades old. So even when you have the information, it's not enough to just know that there is a vulnerability or know that there is an attack impending on that vulnerability. You have to be able to defend it. And so we need different architectures to be able to do that. The third is premature connectivity. For many good reasons, we decided through some of the legislation that we wanted to look at population data across the United States to help understand public health root causes. So, what's the incidence of obesity, of smoking, of alcohol abuse in different demographics? That caused us to connect everything to everything else, even though it was always threat modeled and always designed not to connect to anything else. So that's one of the other issues. Another one is that a single vulnerability in a single system can take down healthcare. Originally, the paper referenced the Hollywood Presbyterian. That was as we now know, the first of many, many ransomware attacks. So being able to equip organizations to defend against operational shutdowns, not just data theft types of operations, is a very significant thing. And then the final one is that a lot of medical hospital equipment, again, partly because it's so old, but even with some of the new stuff, can have hundreds of vulnerabilities. So going beyond the work we're talking about here, which is a prerequisite to it, we need to think about the response at a national level, which will require public policy as well as technical business engineering challenges that we'll have to come up with. So thank you, Mark, for putting on the webinar.
That's really, really helpful. Your perspective is very, very valuable. If you have a minute, I'd like to ask Diana and Fleming if they have questions for you.
Sure.
Diana, Fleming, do you have any questions you'd like to ask Bo before he leaves?
Go ahead, Fleming.
Oh, I'm actually okay. I'm digesting what Bo just mentioned. I will probably follow up later on. Maybe in the next office hour we can get Bo to answer some of them.
That would be wonderful.
Schedule. Yeah, thank you.
That would be great.
Sure.
Yeah, you had a lot of nice holistic and systemic perspectives, which I appreciate very much. Thanks,
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I don't know, Bo, if you, I have been told that the average number of internet connected IoT devices that a patient in a hospital is connected to is 3. And that, of course, in ICU, it can be 30.
Yeah.
And that
Those
those
sound like reasonable numbers, yeah.
and that those devices are completely unprotected.
In some cases, yes. One of the side projects that I do is I run the Biohacking Village Device Lab. And so we bring medical device makers, security researchers, hospitals, doctors, patients into a room out at DEF CON, although it's going to be a virtual room this year. And we have them sit and talk with each other. Medical device makers and some of the security researchers actually bring devices to work on. So the medical device makers want to know what attacks look like on their latest and greatest capabilities. The security researchers and some of the other devices, they're bringing things that are typically found in hospitals. And these are devices that might be 15 to 20 years old. So now if you think about it, 20 years ago, the best security you could get was Windows 2000. Now today, we would laugh at someone who has a Windows 2000 device and says it's secure. But back then it was the best you could get. There are long product life cycles, which means that some of these devices were maybe running Windows 98 or Windows NT 4.0. So those types of devices, when they're in a healthcare environment, they're going to live for that long. There are going to be long-term potential issues with them. So yeah, I don't think it's surprising given those ground truth facts that some of these medical devices that are out there in hospitals hooked up to patients, currently giving them life-saving treatment, will be vulnerable to adversaries of today. And if I were in a hospital hooked up to one of those, I would be first and foremost thankful that it exists, and that the doctors know how to use it, they have training on it, and that it's available to save my life. But secondly, really hoping that in the next generation of products that makes its way into hospitals, that they are better protected than those that, in some cases have, like I said, we're never really threat modeled to be in a hyper-connected environment like they are today.
Okay, so Bo, I know you have to leave. Thank you. Please make a note. I'd like to explore connecting this effort with the DEF CON effort you talked about.
Sure.
We can talk about that offline.
All right, great.
I hope that you'll be able to join office hours same time next Wednesday, and we can pursue things there too. So
All right.
I'll say goodbye for now.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bo.
We could spend quite a bit of time talking about data. I'm wondering, should we move on to analysis, or should we
Mark,
get back to data?
Mark, I wanted to maybe follow up. I know Bo had to go, but I wanted to follow up to his comment related to the medical devices and what we call IoTs in the homes. And so one of the things that we see is very true. A lot of devices, including manufacturing industrial IoTs, they have a long life, right? I would say robotics, for example, in areas where building manufacturing parts for airplanes or for cars, anything like that. So one of the key things is they're not going to get the latest updates on the OS because their software for the robotics is more critical. It's very much like the way he described, smaller medical organizations. You hire doctors before you hire, cybersecurity professional. So in the robotics scenario, the function of the medical IoT is more important. So therefore, those programs, they're not always going to be staying up to date. So the only way, I think, is protect it with the shield. That shield can continuously evolve, but respecting the protocols it needs for it to function, but constantly upgrading that shield. It could be Windows 2000 inside. It could be running BSD or some other operating system or other parts, but outside of it, we can always provide a better shield. So I just wanted to follow up on his insights there. It is one area vendors are looking at. Yeah.
So a shield is important. I think of it as skin. And when we think about our own personal health, our skin keeps 98, 99% of the pathogens out.
Yeah.
But 1 or 2% gets in.
Yeah.
So we have an immune system that catches that 1 or 2%. So we have to have both the skin and an immune system. because we're never going to be perfect at keeping everything out.
I think a better analogy, Mark, is instead of skin, because skin, you can't just constantly upgrade your skin. I would say a mask is a better, because you like what we see is it's not like a firewall kind of scenario, because firewalls they tend to be very persistent in the ways of creating access control and a few other things. It's really about what matters to that IoT, what matters to that device, right? And that shield can continue to evolve while what's underneath that's critical for the business can still function. So I think that's one area, ourselves, we look into that. I think all the vendors are looking at how to provide something like that. So to protect the long-lasting devices in various different industries.
Diana, do you have a comment on this?
I think that they're both valuable approaches, right? They're both looking at different types of attacks or different types of infiltration, and then what are the abilities that we have to deploy to respond to those. And so if we could keep everything out with a shield, that would be 100% perfect. but we don't know if we can get that level of commitment or level of efficiency yet.
Right. It's a battle. It's a challenge.
Okay, so so we haven't done the study yet, but assume that we've collected all this data. Now what? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is normalize it. So one source is collects and uses as different nomenclature, and so how do we normalize it? And then what kind of analytical techniques? And again, we haven't done the full study, but trying to think ahead a little bit and hypothesize where would we, how would we begin to handle these problems? Fleming, do you want to start?
Okay, no problem. And I think, after this particular webinar, especially thinking about the future, one of the things for sure, I'm already taking notes down right now for the cyber security index that I have. I want to make sure I have industry level of kind of view based on industries, because then I can look at what's under attack from manufacturing to healthcare to municipalities and stuff. Last year, I did some work with my team on studying ransomware attacks against local governments, because we thought that would be the biggest thing. Election this year is going to come up. We prepared ourselves, but then everything comes in. Now, healthcare is under a much more critical path right now to recovery for the economy. So I feel like, based on industry and even regions, and basically there's so much we can do to make sure the data is consumable. So yeah, I'm getting excited about that.
This is really great. So I can make a check mark now.
Yeah, it's gonna. I'm gonna show you one of the demos later on.
The whole point of doing these webinars is to change behavior, right? If we don't, yes. If at the end of the day we make all this effort and everybody just keeps doing the same old stuff, we're going to be in the same old swamp. So, we've succeeded in changing your behavior. You've already decided you're going to make a change in how you gather data. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Diana, do you want to comment on this? And maybe you want to show something. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. So so I'll go ahead and share a slide. But one of the things that we've been working on at On Guard is taking a look at the idea that there is. So I think Fleming mentioned it at the beginning, there's a ton of data out there. There's a ton of pieces of knowledge that exist across your organization. And a lot of the times we look at attacks from the perspective of the internet or from the perspective of the attacker. What is the attacker seeing? And one of the things that we started looking at On Guard is what is the perspective from the host or the node? And so there's now an ability to do, basically you can query what's going on at the host. And so we've built out this query. It's massively distributed. And it allows us to ask, you know, a Windows system, what does your current firewall look like? Or what is the permissions on a particular piece of data on your drive? And so the ability to take all of these neurons, these little pieces of data that exist all over the network, and then to pull them back together and to put them into some sort of query engine so that people can find out specific questions, but then also on top of that, artificial intelligence or machine learning where they can use that data to explore more complicated questions. And one of the things that we liked about this is in cybersecurity, old ideas come back around again. And so in the 90s, there was these amazing inference engines called COPS, and there was a scanner similar called Satan. And what they did was they had like an expert system that said, if you can gain root permissions over here, then you will also be able to allow a write over there. And that inference engine provided the most astonishing results to some of the questions that you could ask across the network. And now that the technology has advanced such that we can now query all of these endpoints and bring that data back, those inference engines, I think, will be a big part of how you can analyze and investigate. One of the things I think is interesting about the collecting of this data, and one of the questions you asked was, how do we analyze this data? And part of that is, what are the types of questions that we want to ask? There was a NASA story a couple of weeks ago that they have created a simulation of their entire network. And one of the things it allows them to do is say, if this machine goes down over here, then what happens across our network? And so once we have this data, that would be the kind of questions that I would like to ask is, how do we explore the trust and the interrelationships with devices without actually taking things down on the network? It'd be wonderful if we had that level of detail to provide those types of answers.
Well, that's a very good question, and it leads right into our third question set, which we only have about 3 or 4 minutes for, which is, we haven't done this, we haven't collected the data, we haven't analyzed it, normalized and analyzed the data. So, but in the scientific method, we hypothesize certain things, and then we collect data and we check our hypothesis. So can we hypothesize about what kind of recommendations we would make? I think both started us off with some very good hypotheses. And I think there'll be different ones for government, for industry, for academia, and for not-for-profits. Do you have some ideas about what kinds of recommendations we might come up with?
I'll go ahead and start us off there. I think it would be wonderful if we can get data from all of those locations. And so if we can get organizations to volunteer to give that data, if we can make it structured in some way where they can feel comfortable, it's anonymized, and it hides whatever details are necessary, it'd be wonderful to get data from as many places as possible, from as many vendors and industry and government. That would be great. I think the government side is really wonderful about doing guidelines and potentially all the way to doing standards. And so that's one of the nice parts to sort of structure parts around the industry such that we can all feel comfortable that what we're getting is a certain level of security or a certain level of at least transparency of we know what types of controls they have in place. And then, you know, we need to do the studies and the theories that you're proposing here. And so we need academics and not-for-profits to both do the studies of what is working and what isn't working, do the research, and then do the education. You know, how do we, once we've learned what is effective, how do we get that information out to everyone else?
So, you know, I was thinking about, when you were saying that, I was thinking about Bose mentioning this report that was done by HHS and published in 2017. And that's the first I've heard of it. And so not just doing the work, but you have, I think we have, whatever happens, we have to work really hard to get the information out and make sure that it captures mind share. Because otherwise, there's so, just like there's so much data about cybersecurity coming at us, there's so much data in general and conclusions and recommendations about all kinds of things that we have to make sure that we make sure that what we produce gets attention and gets implemented. Fleming, in 1 minute,
Yeah.
Any thoughts on this?
I do. So I think that well organized question marks right here. So government, for sure, one of the things we have to think about, you know, this pandemic, it really strikes our, you know, physiology, right? Our concerns, our fear, you know, all those things. It's very important for government to actually remove the differences. This is a humanity first thing. So I think it's important for government to work together, making sure at the first order data gets transparency. You know, I think it's important to not to think about who's at fault, what you're getting out of it, and all those things, right? It has to be related to human well-being. The industries, I think that is really a key because the you know, economy will be affected, right? And if you think about the healthcare industry, requires extreme measures to actually protect during a pandemic like this. Academia, I think data science is now a major topic in a lot of the schools, and it's really important for students to learn about how to utilize the tools that's available to you from various different infrastructure and public cloud all the way to GPUs that you might want to create and build yourself. But academia is really where the next generation, the future, they will be prepared to actually maybe even write better code, right? Understand how to secure your software that you're building right at the source code level. So it's really important to be aware. Yeah, so nonprofits really try to pull all these other for-profit you know, entities together, and like what we're trying to do is get data together and provide it in a way that's that will help you know, organizations at all different sizes. So that's my thoughts. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Fleming. That's very good. So for the audience, this whole effort is focused on actually being able to make a change. And to do that, we have to turn the words into action. And if you want to help us do that, we would love to have your help. And you can help by helping in the effort to obtain funding to do this kind of work. We have an effort underway with the US government. It's early stages. We're exploring international funding. We're beginning to think about, we have companies that are helping us with the webinar. We're thinking about looking for other company contributions that could help make this effort real. In the process of doing that, everybody wants to know what our plan is. So we have to develop a detailed plan, detailed enough to make people comfortable to provide the funding necessary to actually get it done. And we welcome volunteers. The easiest way to volunteer is to send an email to info@basesecurity.com. Upcoming office hours are a week from today, Wednesday, 11 a.m. California time. You can join office hours just to contribute ideas for action, resources, action plans. You can explore speaking at future webinars. You can come and ask questions, and we have a Q&A part of every one of the office hours. And then in 2 weeks, we'll have the next webinar, and it's election security in a time of pandemic. Peter Neumann from Stanford Research International, SRI, and Rebecca McCurry from Notable Software will be conducting that. Peter is, we're really happy to have Peter with us. Peter was a colleague and a longtime friend of Becky Bass, and I was lucky enough to work with him for a number of years. He's been a pioneer in this field, and we're really happy that he's able to join us. And I'm hoping that Peter is also a musician. I'm hoping that he can take over the musical start to the program. Diana, would you like to say anything in closing?
No, I just thanks to you for putting this together, and Fleming and Bo for participating. It's always great to have additional voices.
And I'm really happy that, Diana, that you were able to become a participant instead of just the host for all of this. And I think the contributions were really very valuable. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you, Fleming. And
Thank you.
oh, if you're watching the video, thank you. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you in our office hours.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Take care.